Hi everyone, hope you guys are all having a great day. So today is Good Friday, and in honor of that, I thought I would do a video talking about Christ figures in literature. So I will start by talking about what that means, and then I'll get into, I have 4 examples of different kinds of Christ figures in literature. So in literature, we sometimes, well, often, I suppose, we often see characters that in some way, shape, or form reflect what Christ means in the Judeo-Christian religion, meaning either there's some sort of redemption aspect to this person's character, but specifically this character will die, or in some way, shape, or form die, and then and that his or her death is a sacrifice to save other people. And then that character might come back to life, or they might not. It might just be a symbolic death. But any sort of thing like that, it's really about that perfect sacrifice and redemption, which is what Christ has done for us. So I'm going to give 4 examples of stories that I have read that have Christ figures in them. There are many, many more than this, but these are just 4 that, as I was going through the stories that I've read, the ones that meant the most to me. So I will get started with a fantasy one. As I've said in the past, I used to read a lot of fantasy, and I think that this is a very common theme or motif for fantasy authors to use, because it's easy to, well, it's not easy, okay, but there's lots of ways for your character to die in a fantasy novel. So, and then with magic, they can come back to life. So there's lots of different options for that. But the one that I was thinking of is Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. Now, this is just the Fellowship of the Ring. This is the story. This is at the end of the story. Gandalf dies, and he is sacrificing himself for not just the people who are on the quest with him, but really for the whole world that they live in, because if Frodo dies and somebody gets the ring, then, all hell will break loose and take over the whole world. Now, when I read The Lord of the Rings, I only really thought of Gandalf as a Christ figure, but doing a little bit of reading for this video, I saw some people say that it was really interesting because Gandalf, Aragorn, and Frodo are all sort of different aspects of the Christ figure, just like in Christianity we believe in the Trinity. You have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. So Gandalf is more like a prophet or a sage, and he is the one who actually dies as that sacrifice. But Aragorn is the king who will be returning. We call God the King of Kings, and his son is the Prince of Peace. So that makes sense. I can see how Aragorn would fit that role. And Frodo, I had a harder time sort of understanding how he fit the role, but the article I was reading talks about how Frodo bears all evil for all of humanity in the story when he carries the ring. And I can definitely see their point there, because that's what Christ does on the cross for us, is he bears our sin and makes that sacrifice for us so that we don't have to. And, or not even so that we don't have to, but because we physically can't. Not only can we not do it, but he does it so that we don't have to. And that's exactly what Frodo does in The Lord of the Rings. So I thought that was interesting too. It made me see that story in a slightly different way than I had in the past. So that's the only fantasy one I have on the list. The next one is A Tale of Two Cities. Now I know that this doesn't really have a cover, but I just really like this book, so I'm holding it up. Sydney Carton is a Christ figure in A Tale of Two Cities. I just love this book. It's one of the few books I've read that honestly surprised me, and I think it was because I didn't really know Dickens' writing style or anything like that. I'm very rarely shocked by the ending of a book, and I was shocked by this one. So if you haven't read A Tale of Two Cities, I almost don't want to tell you the ending, but the whole time I'm reading it, I'm thinking, why on earth does Dickens keep saying that these two characters look so much alike? What a silly thing for him to focus on, right? I can be so dense sometimes. But then in the end, Sydney Carton takes the life sentence, the death sentence of another person. He sacrifices himself so that this other person can live. And even that is interesting, because that's a Christ figure. He's sacrificing himself for the redemption of somebody else. But he's only doing that to save 2 people. Well, he saves one person and he makes another person happy. That's it. So it's not as grand an idea as Christ dying for the sins of the world, but it's still so perfect and beautiful what Dickens does with that character. So that was my second one. My third one is, again, a little bit different than the typical Christ figure, but that would be Simon in The Lord of the Flies. He is one of the boys that, gets stuck on the island, and so I read The Lord of the Flies in high school, so my memory of it is sketchy, but I went back and did a little bit of reading. And he is depicted like Christ several times. He's fairly innocent. He goes off on his own all the time, like Christ does, and goes off on his own. When they see the crash on the island, and they think it's like a monster or something, Simon goes up to the mountain, like Christ does, and he finds out the truth. And when he comes back and tries to deliver the truth to the people to save them, to tell them the truth, that it's not some monster, it's a human, they kill him. And so he sacrifices himself for the truth, which is, in a way, he's a Christ figure. Now, one of the big reasons that this is different is because there's no redemption in that story, which is the author's point, obviously. So it's talking about the sin nature, the evil nastiness of humanity, and in the story there is no redemption. So slightly different, but still a Christ figure. And then finally, this big old honkin' book, Les Mis by Victor Hugo. The Christ character, the Christ figure that I see the most is Jean Valjean, in the way that he is not a death, as in some of these other stories, but he does sacrifice himself emotionally and physically for the betterment of these other people. And you also see, Victor Hugo's Christianity his brand of Christianity is a little bit different than mine, but you really get these themes of innocence and redemption throughout the story, but mostly I see it in Jean Valjean's character as he goes from a thief and he repents of his sins and he changes, and then he sacrifices of himself to save the lives of his daughter and her lover dude. Some other people on a couple articles I was reading they were suggesting a different character as a Christ figure in Les Mis, and I wouldn't have recognized it immediately, so I thought that was interesting. They were saying that the leader of the political group could have been a Christ figure, which I suppose is possible, but as a Christian, we don't typically see Christ's work on the cross as very political. Now, Jewish culture believes something different. I feel, and I'm not Jewish, so I can't speak for Jewish culture in general, but when the Messiah is talked about in the Old Testament, it is as if he is going to be bringing some hardcore political change to the world, and Christians, we believe that will happen in the future at the end times when, all nations will bow before God. But Jews think that when the Messiah comes, he will be doing that right now. So we have a different perspective on the Messiah, which is interesting, but I think that perhaps the political leader in Les Mis, because he is sacrificing so much for the glory of what is right, I could see him as a Christ figure as well. I'm not saying his name because I can't pronounce it, and I have looked it up, I have tried, and I just can't do it. Those are just a few examples of Christ figures, and I really like how they end up being portrayed in literature. There are all kinds of different ways for authors to do it, and they can do it ironically, they can do it honestly, looking for redemption in a character or in their world. They can flip it around so that it's a very sinful, evil character who makes a sacrifice as the Christ figure. There are lots of different ways, and I always find it so fascinating and interesting when I see it in a story. So I would love to know if you can think of any other Christ figures in literature that you have read. Let me know what you think about all of that, and I hope you all have a wonderful Good Friday and a happy Easter. Thanks so much. Bye.